Thanks. So thank you very much for coming today, and I was really excited when I pulled on campus in the cab and I saw all these security details out. I thought it was excessive for my talk, but as I go through, maybe I will need some. So I'm going to be presenting today on universities with a slightly different perspective from what someone inside a university usually takes. I'm not here to defend a university and what it's doing. I'm not going to tell you what a university should be doing. What I'm going to do is tell you about work we did in response to questions we got from people external to universities. The first one in 2016, before I left Alberta, was with the cratering oil economy. We were asked, should the post-secondary education system in Alberta reorient itself away from oil and gas? So what was being desired at that point was, could they use colleges and universities as an instrument of development to diversify the economy away from oil and gas? Ken Norrie and I, my co-author on it, came up with a very unsatisfying conclusion for them. We told them we could tell them trade-offs and all these exciting things, but until they told us what they thought universities and colleges were for, we couldn't really answer the question. So our main recommendation was, define your objective with all this spending that you're doing. So that led to a different problem, which was I moved to New Brunswick, and again, cash-starved province. Universities seem expensive. No one's really happy with what's going on anywhere. So the issue came up, can the university demonstrate its value to society? And that quickly turned away from society generally writ large, because graduates do go off and they do get jobs elsewhere, and so someone's benefiting from the education. We are drilling down to a more specific question that, as provincially funded institutions, is there a measurable benefit for the provincial economy? The awkward part in doing this study is it's often asserted by universities that these benefits are there, but we don't produce any data that makes this easy to do. It's not comparable across institutions. It's not comparable across provinces. We don't have any good measures often on regional economics anymore for macroeconomic outcomes or employment. So in a way, what I'm doing now is I'm apologizing. I found a bunch of negative results. We spent months doing statistical analysis, and what we've come away with is how do we interpret a finding that there really isn't overwhelming effects of universities on provincial economic outcomes. Now, just as a bit of an anecdote, going to University of New Brunswick, they were going through strategic planning when I arrived. The first strategic planning workshop had some slogan being relevant to New Brunswick society. The faculty went nuts, faculty members at the university. That's not what we're about. We're knowledge creators. It's not about the provincial economy. So the mission statement immediately reverted after that session back to not being about New Brunswick and being about feeding into something more external to the province or not specific to a geography. So this starts to shape what's your next hire going to be and what's the research priorities going to be for. What are provincial taxpayers paying us to do? If you look in your newspaper today, there was a great letter to the editor on you want a law school here apparently. And it was making a great case about what would be the regional benefit of having a law school here rather than importing the human capital back in. So what I was excited about was people here actually talk about things I've been thinking about, whereas other provinces I live in, they rarely are interested in anything I work on. The second thing, if you've read the CAUT bulletin, the president's message this month is really about collegial governance, which really comes down to who gets to decide where resources go. Is it going to be external forces through, say, a board of governors, or is it going to come up through professors who decide the money's in the system, value's being created, professors will decide where it's best served, society is best served putting the resources. And this isn't new. It's also been back before. I'll show you with David Naylor when he was president of the University of Toronto, famously declared that the University of Toronto should be irrelevant to the labor market. That universities are not instruments of our vocational training. They have a much higher purpose in life, and so he was willing to go along with R&D towards commercializable innovation, but the commercialization should not be done inside the university. But again, we're going to go through some models about how people see universities as benefiting the local economy. But one of the things we have to start thinking about is when we talk about this, does local mean the national economy? We're looking for institutions that are globally competitive within Canada. Or are we looking at the provincial economy or even the city economy? I've lived in a couple cities where we were just hoping to be the best university in the city, which is an awkward situation to be in when you can't definitively declare that's the case. So Cathedrals in the Desert is a reference from the literature in regional economics on universities as drivers of growth. And one of the concerns that comes out is that universities are autonomous institutions operating in a detached, non-purposeful way towards the regional economy. And so you basically have a building in the middle of nowhere that no one's really that engaged with. And what you'll see is that there's a tension between that model, which is sort of the passive knowledge factory that universities can be, towards what's called the engaged university, which is universities are actually entrepreneurial and chasing dollars and partnering with everybody that they can find. All of these arguments are not correct to say it's an either or. I think what we're really talking about is what's the balance between the engagement of the university with the community versus the passive knowledge factory and the traditional teaching mission. And there's also a part I can't really get into, but the ahistorical nature of the debate currently on the policy front about the role of research and everything. Canadian universities were not really important research universities until around the 1970s. You have the Bantings and guys like that historically, but for the most part, Canadian universities were teaching institutions. We import most of our PhD talent up until the 1970s, 1980s, and now we're going back to importing most of it again. We're exporting PhDs, but we're not hiring them. So you get these shifts going on, and we built up the mythology of what the university does. But when we had a teaching mission and we were relatively cheap, we didn't have a lot of these questions coming up about what are you doing with the money, as long as people sort of saw the graduates finding places in the world. What I'm going to show you now is universities are incredibly expensive for doing the same output on the teaching front that we did 25 years ago. We have a research mission that's come in, and that's not necessarily showing up in any of the productivity statistics or other things that the bean counters might look at. So the question we're going to have to ask ourselves, is that okay? And I'll give you the arguments why it's okay. And then another one, could we do something different? I'll give some arguments for that. I don't have many strong views on this, other than it is really awkward when university administrators want me to come in and demonstrate their value and I can't find it, because I know they want to go and talk to a premier. But anyhow, here goes. So one of the quotes I liked is from a classics professor in the 19th century who kind of, when I couldn't find any good results, came up with something that helped me. The word useful should be banished from the university vocabulary. Now, this is what you get with an endowment-funded university. You're not beholden to anybody. And so the mission of university as a pure knowledge creator is kind of where Basil's coming from on this front. There's various forms of this quote that comes up through the literature over the next century when there's tension about what is a university and what is it for. The question I'm asking in this presentation is, do provinces experience higher GDP growth, labor productivity, and innovative activity measured by total factor productivity? Other people have used patents and things like that, by investing in their own universities. So why does a province need to have its own university when there are other universities in Canada where you can get ideas and you can import people? Within the university, I'm sure you've had this about, should we have PhD programs in Newfoundland? Would we hire our own graduates, or do we want them from somewhere else? So it's one of these things that you can do it at the highest level of education, PhD, then you get down to master's, and it starts to come down to, do we really need a university? So if you're always asking these questions, you can always get down to, what is the value of investing locally versus importing? Now, the troubling part is, why don't we know the answer to this question right away? Why can't we just come up with, what is the value, what's it worth, what's the productivity kick? Part of the problem is that for 30 years, we've been operating on a mission of developing the national labor market and the national economy. Particularly after the Macdonald Commission in the 1980s, the big focus in Canada, with all that surplus labor and high unemployment rates in some regions, was about regional adjustment. University education, particularly the bachelor's level, was fantastic for prying underemployed people out of some regions and moving them to other places where there were jobs. So the difficulty answering this question is that we've always thought about the answer in terms of the national economy. Are we contributing to Canadian GDP? And I'm not going to challenge that that's occurring, although I don't want to go and look either. the question is, what's been the return to the provincial economy? So we do have graduates mobile across jobs, employers, industries, regions, and nations. I would argue that the success of former Newfoundlanders across the country shows the value of the education that's come out of the institution. So that's not what we're debating. The question is who's monetizing it. The increased research intensity has been one of the challenges to justify over the last 20 years. There's a study in 1991 by Robert Lucas Jr. who showed the median number of publications for an economist in Canada was 1 for a career. It's now up to 4. But it's one of those things where historically the research mission was not as critical as the teaching one. And so it's a bit different now that we have had governments investing a lot more in research capacity in the provinces. And so the question is increasingly coming up with the resource use, are we getting good value for money? Yeah?
Just a question, but when you were looking at the empirical evidence of universities, did you do the university as a whole, or did you break it down by, say, discipline? So for instance, did you look at necessarily engineers or nurses versus philosophy, economics, classics?
Yes. We've cut it a lot of ways, and what you'll see when I get to the statistical results, the only faculty or type of students we find with an impact on the local economy is engineering. And again, it tends to be more related to, and again with engineering it's interesting because there's a tension between engineering science and applied science. And so it's the applied science, not the engineering science, which tends to have more effect. So again, engineering has more of a predisposition towards your local industries in the resource sector or your utilities, which may have different technologies. And when you talk about engineering in Canada, there's incredible heterogeneity across the programs across the country, whereas if I asked you about economics programs in Canada, they're all similar. Every student's going to take roughly the same courses. They're going to cover the same content. So there's something different about engineering than, say, a humanities degree or an arts degree. So economics is a fantastic degree to get if you're a student who wants to get the heck out of someplace and go somewhere else. It's even valuable if you want to stay because there's often a need for it, but you're competing with imports as well because you are not a differentiated product quite often. Whereas an engineer can be differentiated because they know the systems in the power utility that are local, whereas the guy you bring in might take more time to get up to speed. So we did do those differences. We did it by cities, universities in specific cities. We did provinces. We didn't get to countries. We've studied the impact of medical research on avoidable mortality. So we've done other types of outcomes. And it all comes up with the same kind of story. But again, I didn't mention that study that we did for the medical faculties was in Alberta when Jim Prentice, before he died, was premier. He had announced he was no longer funding medical research because it was cheaper just to import the best ideas from around the world. Unfortunately, the medical schools were built on soft-funded money from the Alberta Heritage Foundation for Medical Research, so Jim Prentice also announced he'd cratered the medical faculties. So they asked us, could we come up with any evidence that all this medical research was making a difference? And we were able to use disruptions to medical research funding historically across provinces to do kind of a structural breaks that are correlated with those disruptions, showing that if you're like Saskatchewan with no research capacity, you have a really high avoidable mortality rate. So diseases that are preventable, injuries that you could have saved someone from. Whereas when you're a research-intensive university, like Alberta was at periods of time, they tended to trend down towards Ontario and BC. When they disrupted the funding and fired the scientists, they went back up to Saskatchewan. So we were translating into a number of avoidable deaths due to having the research culture. None of it was related to what they actually researched. It had, we think, more to do with the culture that comes in with a research group of researchers. They're your receptors for ideas. They're the people who get things applied. And so we weren't trying to say you need a cancer researcher studying this. It was really more who they were bringing in under the research funding. And they started changing the rules. When they were doing it for early career people, they got more benefit than when they were using money to sustain late career people. So there's a certain dynamism to it as well. There's very little empirical evidence that universities drive growth of a regional economy, either at the level of city, state, small countries. The evidence that is there suggests that there's, at best, a small or modest impact on non-university wages, and it tends to be in places that are pretty small, like less than 200,000 people employed. So the larger you get, the less impact of a university, the smaller place you can find it. But then when they start cutting it by period of time, pre-2008 and post, the effect goes away. So the challenge is nothing's really robust, and everyone's trying to make a case that universities are going to grow the economy because we'll do solar panels and all these other things. But we can't show it in the macro statistics easily, which makes it kind of awkward. So I'll go through some of those as well. Now, this is David Naylor from the University of Toronto. In 2009, he was at the Empire Club, and he talked about this as fending off university attacking zombies. So people keep attacking universities and saying they've got to be more about job training, they've got to be more about specific labor market needs and industry needs. And he's calling for universities to be detached from that. And so the decline in world rankings of Canada's big universities was a direct result of Canada's highly egalitarian approach. Canada refuses to focus its resources on a select number of top research universities strategically so they could compete. So I work for a place and you guys work for a place that's the problem. So Canada is struggling because we have too many universities taking too much of the resources. Go back to Wade's problem within the university. Now this is the thinking that comes down, that you'll have some dean saying, we could be world class here if you would just kill those guys. Give me their budget and I'll get you to the promised land. Countries around the world are picking winners, investing heavily in them. So they're coming up the ranks while Canada's slipping. The risk is Canada can end up with many mid-ranked institutions, but the lack of a big flagship institutions that drive investment, research, and development in the economy. So in other words, he's asserting the link between a world-class university and the growth of the Canadian economy. We should be able to make the same claim that if we had a flagship regional university, we should be able to demonstrate the growth is going on here. He argues that the biggest problem, if we keep doing this, not helping U of T get better, is young Canadians will suffer because of this. Now, to be fair, in his world, and I was at Calgary when this was coming up, and we weren't part of the Big Five, so we were fighting this strongly, is the role that is there if you're not one of these flagship universities is you're going to train the undergrads that will then go there for grad school. So you're the feedstock, but please stop researching and leave it to the adults. It seemed to be the message coming in. And at one point, this was proposed as the full tri-agency budget would go to 5 institutions. Anyone okay with that? Or? So regional impact should matter for provincial taxpayers. University operations are funded provincially. Smaller population provinces have less fiscal capacity to fund these kinds of research-intensive world-class places. We have fiscal challenges in a lot of provinces. Deficits are becoming chronic again. You have population aging, which is even changing where the needs are in your society. And so if we're going to sustain the current scale of university operations and research in particular, you have taxpayers who, they can't find a doctor, they can't get into long-term care. They start to wonder, is it really our best use of money to put them towards that university? And so again, this is where all of a sudden the light's shining on universities saying, can you justify your ROI compared to us just hiring some more doctors? Provincial taxpayers have less appetite for subsidizing exports of young population to other regions with declining and aging population, and in a lot of the Atlantic region, labor shortages. Why aren't we training kids for the jobs that are here? Why do we keep sending them abroad? And then we have to go out and find immigrants to replace the kids that we didn't keep. So there's a sense in which universities are no longer aligning with the needs and priorities of society. But 30 years ago, you know, with surplus population, we couldn't get people out of here quick enough. And that was true in Ontario as well. I got shipped out to the west. One of the problems that we face is I think we've lost sight of within the university of just how much is being spent on universities in Canada. The total, this is from CAUT, I think it's this line here is billions of dollars spent on university education in Canada. Since 2000, governments have been very generous towards universities. We're now up, according to this graph, at about $30 billion is the total spend in Canada. So it's not like we're being choked up until this point. We're at record high expenditures on universities from public sources. The complaint the CAUT has is that the proportion going on salaries has declined on this axis. So we're resourcing universities more, a lower proportion is going on salaries, and so there's this kind of idea that the money's not being used in the best way. But if I'm not in the university and I'm a taxpayer, I'm asking, why do you need more money? What are we getting for all this investment? And I've tried to do this with healthcare as well, because over the same period it's doubled as well.
You're just building buildings, is that what you're saying?
No, we don't know. There's just a higher spend on universities. So when universities say you're choking us, the challenge is, I'm going to show you where the student-to-faculty ratio was in 1990. So we were able to do with around $15 billion what it's taking $30 billion to do today. So if you look at salaries, in 2012, on a purchasing power parity adjusted basis, Canadian professors are the highest paid in the world.
Is that pure salary, or does that include benefits?
Salary and benefits, compensation. We have more university teachers up around 2014, 2015 than we had historically. The whole system got bigger, we got better paid, and as you know, the research intensity went up, which meant teaching went down. So the challenge we have outside of the university is we become expensive in the eyes of funders. Lots of money's going in, and so the questions that we argue they should be asking are things like, why are you spending that on hospitals? Why are you spending that on doctors? They're now starting to say, why are we spending that on universities? So we need to think about what's the response. If you look at the student-to-faculty ratio, Newfoundland is this blue line. There were around 15 full-time students per full-time faculty member in Newfoundland in 1991, and currently are sort of a bit higher than that, but going back towards 15. So in other words, all that expansion of resources was coming through the growth in enrollment that was coming with the baby boom echo, the notorious Ontario double cohort, which I think has been counted 85 times in all the statistics. If you look at Canada overall has a rising student-to-faculty ratio, which is largely coming from the growth in Ontario and the West. But in Atlantic Canada, we're all trending back down to the same number of students we had in the 1990s. So again, if you're the provincial government and you're looking at the trajectory in student enrollment, why is it taking twice as much money to do what you did back there? What are we getting for it? So this is our real challenge, is we have declining demand in a sense for what we provide, other than the research, if we can make a case that the research is doing something good. And so this is our cost-benefit problem. We're paid a lot. That's a lot of what's increased the costs of doing all this. And we have the same demand we had 20 years ago in terms of students. So in answering this question, we've started with one, necessity and sufficiency. Are local provincial universities necessary for regional growth? Do you have to have a university in order to have good GDP growth? So the idea here is that, do skills, knowledge, and ideas produced by universities in the region have close substitutes that can be imported from producers outside the region? If you're an import competing university, then it really is just going to come down to you do it cheaper. But if you're producing something that can't be obtained through the open market, then you have an opportunity to have an impact on the local economy. So the necessity really comes down to how substitutable are the skills and ideas. So we lived this in Alberta when the Premier announced we're not paying for medical research anymore. Best ideas are freely available around the globe. We don't have to pay for anything. Shut the medical schools down unless they're training doctors. And it was literally for the purpose of putting the money into frontline services. So that was the most direct example that I've seen. So a province can invest in its own universities, or it can free ride on the human capital and innovation done elsewhere. This brings us down in this situation to a cost effectiveness decision. Is it cheaper to produce the labor here or just import it from somewhere else?
Some of the investment
Yeah.
somebody else's expense.
Yeah.
The other big bargain.
And so I'll come back to that one as well, because that's a part of a change in mission of universities around the education for export that has some interesting properties as an export sector. So again, I'm not thinking about any human beings in this. I'm thinking about economic. This is an industry. We're thinking about supply, demand. We're thinking about our production technologies. I find the dehumanizing of it makes it easier to ask some of the questions. But when I'm asking, do we have too many people in this hallway, that makes it a little more uncomfortable then. And is that black box a little too big? So in this case as well, we're looking for market failures or positive externalities. These are the spillovers that come from having a more highly educated workforce. If you like Richard Florida's work, the more educated people you put in one place, the more growth you should get. If I have one that's been really useful to see is, again, it's largely been out of engineering and computer science, but if you have really good professors and students, you tend to get more startups in the local area. So universities have been pushing on that to get more entrepreneurial activity, more innovation. They've just struggled to replicate what MIT and Stanford and some of these other places have done. So that's led to another literature, is it the professors or the students? Research universities may have localized spillover benefits for the regional economy. In particular, you can find a lot of historic examples in resource sectors where we haven't known how to produce something, say the oil sands out west or offshore drilling. There may be a story that ties back to a local engineering capacity that figured it out. And it may not have been the university directly. It might have been the graduates who hung around and were able to work on it. So there's lots of those kinds of stories. The big one that we look for is, does the presence of a university's research and training programs, does it raise the productivity of local non-university producers? So in other words, it's a place in which ideas get translated from, let's say, academia or the globe, coming through the university and deployed into the labor market or deployed into the producer ecosystem. So these are the kinds of spillovers that people talk about in this literature. The other one is that ideas may be free, but applying them in your region isn't. That you can take a machine that worked in place A, but it doesn't quite work in place B. You might have different sized trees. You might have different reservoir properties. You're going to need some local capacity that figures out how to bring the idea in, actually apply it, and get it in use. So again, that speaks to a role a university could play in order to get it. Are local provincial universities sufficient for regional growth? So in other words, if I put one in a city, I resource it, am I going to get growth in my provincial economy? So the first thing we'd have to worry about is that if I put this university in, and this is in the context of people want to start new universities. So if you're in one that's already going on, you should be aware that there's also now demand to put them into places like Oshawa and grow them at the expense of universities that kids don't want to go to anymore, like Sudbury or Thunder Bay. So this starts to tie in with some of the desire to redistribute where the assets are. Yep.
We can see, did you look at, one of the roles of the university is to, one of the functions potentially is, we have people doing research and innovation here, and because you have a small business sector, you're able to collaborate and cooperate with them, enhancing their ability to do that. So, is there any indication of that reflective of that?
Yes, I'll give you some graphs shortly, but that gets down into this point here about raising the productivity of the local producers. You said it much better.
So let me ask another question.
Yeah.
So part of the, we can all buy software and hardware, fancy computers and really neat software to do kind of things like you can buy Stata, and if you don't know how to use Stata, then having Stata on your computer really doesn't help, right? So same thing with any technology, you don't know how to adapt it to the local environment you're talking about environment for. Presumably one of the roles of the university is to help people understand and to engage in research in order to be able to adapt and apply particular research, like a piece of software, to a unique problem that exists in your world. Do you control for that kind of stuff?
No, but I want to rephrase the way you put it. You've identified what a university could do.
Okay.
The question we have to ask is, are universities doing that? But you are correct. The universities could be playing that role and have played that role. Like we did show that with the medical research one with the avoidable mortality. It's a little harder to show with macro level variables, but one reason for a negative result that local universities are not impacting on local growth is because universities are not doing that kind of thing. They're doing something else. So this is the real challenge we had with this kind of work, is that if universities are for a purpose and we know that they're doing that purpose like an intervention, then we would expect to see an outcome. If we don't find the outcome, it could be because universities aren't operating for that purpose. They're not doing those actions, and so why would I expect to see the outcome? And the big challenge we're going to come down to is we don't really know what universities are doing, what they should be doing, or even how to define what they should do. And within campuses, like I can get yelled at if I present this at some places. People don't like this discussion. I don't even know if you've heard about the slow movement. It's a new approach. The best way to serve knowledge is to not do our jobs. So we should refuse to teach. We should refuse to research because that makes us neoliberal human capital producers. And knowledge is not served by that, so universities in the slow movement where you resist work is about the self-actualization of the faculty member. So that one just threw me for a loop trying to do this stuff, because if we got a bunch of self-actualizers, then I wouldn't expect GDP to grow other than by a passive multiplier effect, which I'll come back to as well. So it gets really weird when you start reading about what people think universities are for. There's a really irreverent book that I don't agree with all of it, but it's entertaining, by Stanley Fish, called Save the World on Your Own Time, that gets into all these things about what people think they're supposed to be doing in their job, and no one's ever told us what our job is. Has anyone ever told you what you're supposed to be doing?
Well, I'm an engineer, and I studied an engineering school.
Yeah.
Any professional school having a fairly defined mission. And basically training future engineers. I have some issues with both the university and the local association. Nobody seems to care how many engineers you produce. So there's heavily in favor of knowledge, only involvement of engineers. And engineering students have seen cycling many times. Electronics is the highest yield. Hordes of students sign up for electronics. 5 years later, the market is saturated, and there are no civil engineers.
Yeah.
So, some of that you can't control. If you're smart enough to look at traffic engineering, you're probably going to figure out civil engineering.
I think most of the IT professionals out west were engineers from civil, so they were making the stretch the other way, because when the market's short, they'll take anyone who can figure it out. When the market's in glut, they get more specific. But the real challenge, like when I was hired, it was loosely in a field. No one actually told me what they needed me to teach, but you got assigned courses. It took 5 years before we even had a discussion about what should be taught in the course, if it was a core one. And that was being forced by administrators demanding students know why they were taking certain courses and what the endpoint was. The explicit syllabus era, I don't know if that ever hit here. But by the time I left Calgary, they just were doing this method of hiring in economics called the best athlete, which didn't serve teaching needs or any particular research synergies. It was just hiring the guy that was most likely to get into AER. So we sort of, maybe I personalized this too much, but a big challenge if universities are going to have an effect is that universities are just one place where teaching and innovation can go on. So if universities are small relative to the whole, what do they call it here, regional knowledge infrastructure. I like literatures where they keep coming up with terms and acronyms. So if universities are just a piece of a bigger thing that involves lots of private sector companies that do their own training, that do their own R&D, then it may be that universities don't show up as that vital in a place where they're a small piece of the overall infrastructure. Atlantic Canada, this isn't the case. universities are actually the most important part of the regional knowledge infrastructure. And I'll show you the statistics for this. So universities in our region are particularly reliant on universities for R&D. Research funding comes largely from federal government granting agencies for the most part. And this is despite the fact that federal money is largely concentrated in the large population provinces. Half of CIHR money goes to Toronto alone, I think. And so the fact that we're highly dependent on what's left over tells us that universities for this region should be pretty important. The question we have to ask, though, and this goes back to Wade's a bit, are universities complements or substitutes for other forms of regional knowledge infrastructure like business R&D? Do the universities help it, or are universities offsetting a lack of it?
In engineering, the engineers, the professional engineers should be complementing technology, technicians.
Again, we're back to should be. We'll come back to what they are doing.
When I started out 50 years ago, we were talking about one engineer for 3 technicians.
Yeah.
It's about one engineer for maybe 1.4.
Huh.
So with a lot of engineers who do technologist work. And I gave you a sample of actually nothing.
Oh, I can't add anything more to these studies. So these are numbers from CANSIM on gross expenditure on research and development, all sectors. The red line is Canada overall. These are per capita dollars. So on average in Canada, it's gone from about $400 total expenditure on R&D up to about $700. Newfoundland is the dashed blue line. It's gone from around 100 up to around 400. You can start to see the oil economy kicking in. This is 2015. My happy place, New Brunswick, is down here at the bottom. It's where the least amount of R&D appears to be occurring. Nova Scotia is the green line, which is the highest for the region. And the red dashed line is the average for the 6 smaller population provinces, around 1 million or less. So what you get from this story is that we don't have a lot of R&D expenditures occurring in the region compared to Canada overall. If you bring it down to business-performed research and development expenditures, not a lot of BIRD is occurring in our region. So business-sourced R&D is not something that happens in the Atlantic region very much. It does happen in the rest of Canada. So again, the scale here is about $450 at the peak compared to closer to less than 100. So 4.5 times the amount of business-sourced R&D is occurring in the rest of Canada versus our region. Now for Newfoundland, you can see the huge jump around 2005 up to 2015. Businesses were putting more money into R&D, but not on the scale as the rest of Canada.
Those 2 graphs there,
Yeah.
they're inputs.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, the big issue you have is measuring the output.
Yes.
In terms of, so how do you measure output?
Well, for the purpose of these graphs is to show the high reliance on universities in the region. So the next 2 will make the point after we show low business. For the outputs, we're going to look at is just GDP growth, productivity growth, employment growth, population growth. We just went looking for any outcomes we could. Tax filer incomes, median incomes, total taxes paid. Yeah, we were shaking the bag hard. But the main point I want to make with these graphs is this is not tied to an outcome at all. When we throw these in the right-hand side of the model, GERD, BIRD, HERD, the other categories, they're not correlated with anything as an outcome. They're just a measure of the level of activity on R&D. It's not actually something you can tie to GDP growth. You might be able to do it with OECD level data. There should be a bunch of those reports. If you get to the higher education performing sector, what we find out is that without business-related R&D expenditures in the region, it's basically all coming through universities. And so the Atlantic provinces have a high reliance on higher education research funding, and even expenditure by provincial governments on universities. Nova Scotia is the one with the highest amount of expenditure. Newfoundland went from the middle of the pack up until around 2005 and is now rivaling Nova Scotia for this higher education R&D number.
You understand why that is?
Oil and gas, I would guess.
Well, we're required here to spend money on education training and R&D as a percent of the value of revenue produced.
Okay, I wasn't aware of that one. But again, you can see the surge that's come into your university sector
And the
with
other
it.
bump, you see there's a big bump up there, I think it's Long Harbor, where they did the HMP plant. That's what that is.
So new,
So that's performance. So what does that tell you?
just that this is a large portion of the R&D research, what was it, knowledge capital in the region. New Brunswick, again, is this low number down here. If you look at percentages of GERD by sector, when you get to the Atlantic provinces, the 40% that's coming from the higher education sector is around double what it is in the rest of the country. So the only point from these graphs is that universities are really important for the R&D potential of the region, in part because there's a lack of business-related R&D. So the question we have is, are the universities substitutes or complements for the business stuff? So if there's a lack of business investment, can you make it up through the universities? Or as the literature would argue, you use the universities to offset the lack of scale economies, the lack of agglomeration effects. So you focus your money on a university and it will start your engine and get your R&D system going. Or is it the case that if I resource the universities, it's supposed to leverage in more of that business-related R&D? Now, if you're a professor inside the university, you may not be aware that this is how policymakers are talking about universities. What can they do for us? You're thinking, I'm going to publish something this month. It's going to be exciting. I got a ton of students going on. But the debate that's going on in the R&D literature is, what do we need to do with the universities to get more of these startups, more of the innovation, more of the growth?
Or more collaboration.
Yeah.
We have more collaboration.
Well, collaboration says that these things are complements. And so we need to have the money we put into universities now being moved towards collaboration as opposed to independent inquiry by professors. So there's a nice podcast on the Freakonomics one called My Next $100 Million. So if you had $100 million for engineering in Canada, where would you put it? Would you pick U of T or would you pick MUN? And the punchline is you would pick MUN, not U of T. So I'll let you listen to the podcast to hear the great argument, but it's actually an experiment that was done in New Jersey that was really about moving away from the engineering science of a U of T or a Stanford, where they were focusing money on a small number of elite students from away, like outside the country, to one that was going to be more of a ground-up, train the locals to be engineers that were going to work on local industrial needs. So it's an interesting one to see. Are local university missions and activities oriented towards the needs of the regional economy?
It's part of our mission statement here, right? I don't know that.
Yeah. Do you have regular meetings to see how you're doing on it, or have you revised your curriculum to take account of new needs emerging in the local labor market? Yeah.
I think even if, it's your mission statement and you're even actively having meetings to kind of address it and see how you're doing, it's kind of also hard to even approach from the university standpoint. For instance, if we look at the local economy here, all of the computer science class for the past, I think, like 2 or 3 years have been hired by a local business called Emery. But if you are saying, okay, well, clearly Newfoundland's having, or at least St. John's, is having a shortage of programmers. What do? We try to promote the use or the enrollment in our computer science program. Well, that's a 4-year fix at minimum. And 2, are you necessarily going to have the capacity to promote people to join programmers? Because if you look at a computer programmer, obviously there's going to be exceptions, but typically it's a certain type of person. I personally would never want to do programming, even if I hear it's a great job. So you have to kind of stimulate interest, and even though that could be a very easily identified labor market issue, you might not necessarily know of a firm that's having a labor market issue that doesn't necessarily make it public. So
No,
how
but
would you-
so where it gets interesting, and this is what we were dealing with the diversification question in Alberta, is suppose we just increased that program in size to glut the market. Maybe we would attract firms. And so there was actually a discussion on sort of using the next cohort of kids to be sort of a lottery ticket. We'll glut the market with this skill. That will attract the capital, and then we'll have our local industry. There was a lot of discussion around the ethics of doing that, that we create programs for which there aren't actually jobs, hoping it will create the jobs. And the 90s, it was all environmental science programs that the graduates were struggling to find work, even compared to someone who just did biosciences. And then they created master's programs, which downgraded the value of the bachelor's one.
We got history, so you don't need to study.
Now, in the engineering business, I've had the distinct impression
Yeah.
for years and years that we produce, we're not particularly constrained about the numbers of different types of engineers we produce. So electronics has been, I think, quite attractive, so we produce more of electronics engineers than we need, and the surplus goes off to the US. And we don't produce enough mining engineers, and we bring music immigrants, so we're not, have not been historically constrained to
Yeah.
produce graduates for market. Surplus goes to the US, deficits we have with position we can bring immigrant engineers to do those jobs that aren't that jazzy.
And this is a real challenge, right? Is that when we talk about being able to plan on this level, labor market needs, even if they're 5-10 years out, it's going to take you that long to even get the first cohort through. So the issue is really around who should be making these decisions and what is the portfolio. Like what we're really talking about is when the next position becomes available in your institution, which faculty does it go to first? Then within the faculty, which department, and then within the department for which particular part of the curriculum are needs. So do you want a civil engineer? Do you want an electrical? And so this is the problem, is that you're making a hiring decision for 30, 40 years based on potentially a labor market need of 1 or 2. Or do you have to start thinking about other approaches where maybe who gets to decide what the trend is or the labor market need is going to be with a projection? And how do you make sure that you're going to fit that? Do the students chase it, so you use bums and seats? Do you have the flexibility to do that kind of hiring?
I have been associated with the co-op engineering conference and pioneers, and we did have a real-time sample. If you're interested in biomedical engineering, you might as well forget it, because there's so few opportunities. So we did our best to meet all the student expectations, but
Yeah.
we wound up with a sample that was fairly representative of what was available, and not just in Atlantic provinces, but up to mainland provinces as well. So I think this had potential to perhaps control the faculty from going off wild in 70 directions at the same time, which
Yeah.
seems to happen sometimes.
The bigger problem for the university is that despite all the models that we might produce, we don't have a good sense of what the future labor market demands might be,
Right.
right? So we just went through a period prior to 2013 where if you were, and community colleges promoted this as well, and now you've got a university degree, let's do something you can use in life, right? And that was had a value because people could go away, work in the oil sands and make a lot of money with a welding trade or whatever. And they could make a lot more money than you could as an investor for sure. And so now, most people don't have the same opportunities they had before. So it is important, I think, to have somewhat of a general good education to give you some flexibility to try
Right.
to deal with whatever comes your way, because I'm sure a lot of people who made that decision thought it was great when they made the decision. May not think it's so great now.
So 2010, I think it was when Thomas Lemieux's presidential address to the CEA, his focus was on the declining return to university degrees. And the pressure at that point was governments wanted to take money out of university teaching and move it towards the colleges, because they were chasing that cycle you're talking about. There's opportunities over here. Let's get those kids out of philosophy and move them into welding. And again, the same result always comes up. There's a steady average rate of return to a university degree. It's not really growing or declining over time. And the college ones tends to be boom and bust. If we're building houses, trades do great. If we're not building houses, they're not doing great. And we have had a weird 15 years of where we've used credit to basically fuel consumption and house building. There's a real estate bubble that's kind of distorted some of these things. So the university, as I'm going through saying, we're lacking relevance, may suddenly come roaring back because this is exactly what we need. Because we can adjust with kids with this level of education. You can't adjust a kid with specific training skills to the same degree. So I haven't got to the slide yet, but one of the reasons universities may not show up in growth is that hasn't been their role. As part of a national economy, it's been more of an instrument of regional adjustment, both positive and negative. If you have these importable skills, if you're the booming region, you draw people in. If you're the busting region, you send them out. And we've all gained from having that kind of adjustment, but now governments are changing their priority to we want growth.
I think you shouldn't underestimate the college programs.
Well, I'm not underestimating them.
But I'm saying some of
Yeah.
their kids, I think they are entitled to a somewhat raw engineering base. You know?
Yeah.
If I look at, go back in my own family, my granddad has 5 years of education, and he was a very successful businessman. He was a church leader. He used to discuss religious matters with his neighbor who probably had even less education. But they did have a certain culture and a commitment, and a basic, some basic tools that they were able to go a long way on. Nowadays, those tools may have to be more sophisticated. But I think that the diploma from the collegiate level should at least have the basics of the science and technology they're using. It doesn't have to be wrapped up in differential equations. It can be presented a little more accessibly.
Yeah.
When you send it, when you bring it into say bachelor's level course, master's where I was, those differential equations kind of go over my head. They're really complicated. But
Yeah. No,
you need to know the basic science on it.
sure. And again, there's a challenge because the pressure on colleges is to move towards being quasi-universities. So they don't go the full distance, but they're turning more away from specific training programs, more towards like general business programs. They want to do more of the applied technical sciences out west. I know that.
Well, I was very unhappy many decades ago. Ryerson Institute of Technology became Ryerson University.
Yeah.
I thought it was a terrible decision. A really world-class technology college.
But it fit the needs of what Toronto was looking for through the double cohort, which was more university
Yeah, no,
spaces.
that's
Yeah.
way before that.
Yeah.
I think that was certain individuals
Yeah.
who pushed the agenda rather than maybe a province-wide kind of policy that might have more
probably introduce myself a little bit anyway. Bill, I'm an engineer. Senility is setting in early. So I've become interested in economics. Especially world economics.
Yeah.
And to me, the way it's going is all messed up. I think a lot of the world is beginning to be. But that's why I'm interested as an engineer. The type of stuff you're talking about there, the sensitivity to the outcome is so small compared to other things which change what's necessary. Regularly, a slight change in legislation
Yeah.
could have way more effect than anything you could think of. Right? I think that's the reason why all of the west coast of the states is populated with all the research they got, rather than the natural place, which was the east coast, where all the Ivy League did change in legislation. Change the library anyway.
Yeah.
So there's much to do about nothing, really.
Could be.
So why not just consider yourself or ourselves as services, which is what we are, service.
Right.
Why are we different from a hospital?
What service are we providing?
Education.
Okay, so
Yeah, it's education.
what about research?
Hmm?
Is the research a service?
Well, there's research at hospitals, there's research everywhere. Wherever anybody gets an idea, somebody gets an idea, they'll figure out how
Well,
to work on it.
no, but I agree with your basic point. It's about we offer a service. And the question is, what is the service we're offering and how much does it cost the taxpayers to pay for it?
Oh, yeah,
So the-
maybe that should be 10%.
So the challenge we're facing is that if a government says the service you need to be providing better be tied to the growth of our economy, and instead the service we're providing is to help kids get the heck out of here if it doesn't grow.
I would start arguing about how you define the growth of the economy, but that's bigger.
Yeah, no, we'll get to that. You may want to like it once we come around to show the importance of engineering. But so basically here, the question is universities can have these effects, but you often have people like Wade who actually have an interest in the local area, and he's oriented a lot of time and effort. If Wade retires, or when Wade retires, is he going to be replaced by someone who has the same devotion to Newfoundland and making things better? Or are we going to have someone replaces him who's more interested in studying how are things going in Ohio, which tends to happen in a lot of cases. So again, are we doing things by accident or design? So when you get to the knowledge factory idea, part of what happened is that we've trusted universities just by what they do to get the right outcomes. So we don't talk about it. It's just we think that we know ideas are created and knowledge is created, and they're going to somehow passively make it into the business sector. They're going to passively make it into the students who are going to go out and do it. So we don't have to worry about these questions, and we just have to go out and look at our outcomes, and we'll see evidence of this. So the passive knowledge factory politically on campus is the easiest one to live with because we don't have to tell anyone to do anything. Just do your best. We'll watch the outcomes occur. If you've ever coached a sports team, you know this model doesn't work too well. You always get one kid who wants to go just sit in the corner while the puck's out front in the crease, and you got to start screaming. And in other cases, there's a desire to see universities more engaged. And this is where we're starting to see a lot of tensions on campus about who's making decisions, the board, the Senate, the professors who run the programs, or is it coming from letting the private sector direct where the next resource allocation will go. But the idea here is that economic and fiscal conditions and flagging public support for universities or academic research are seeing a desire for universities to change what they do away from what professors want to do and more towards professors responding to what society needs them to do. So you'll start to hear these euphemisms like engagement, getting out more outreach, more KT, those kinds of things. So in this case, it can be driven by budgets, public revenues. Ontario right now is coming up with lots of models where bums and seats drives your budget. So if you can get students in your classroom, you get more positions, more revenues. If the students don't want to take what you're offering, you're going to lose them. And so we are seeing budget models evolving around this. There's also the idea we can be profit centers. So you're seeing these, the commercialization type offices coming in, the intellectual property. And some of this is coming from, as universities are losing traditional base budgets through government and tuition sources, we can save ourselves just by getting big ideas, commercialize them, and keep the profits. And so then there's another tension about what if you're the professor who came up with the idea and you watch your university suddenly get rich. You start to see those professors either moving or not doing the activity. That was at least the argument out west. Yeah.
Another problem with that is that there was a study done, I think it was in Germany, I'm pretty sure, and it showed that even to get like an idea that for the first dollar of revenue from that idea, it was I think an $8 million investment. And
Yeah.
that doesn't necessarily even cover that investment. It's just on average, it's $8 million before you get any return.
Right, but
at all.
the only word they will usually come up with is RIM. That everyone believes that can happen again, and that they're on the verge of getting the next one. Come to Fredericton, we'll tell you all about the Cybersecurity Institute, which currently has your ratio that you brought up. Will it turn into an industry that generates millions and millions for the province? I don't know. I'm a risk-averse professor. I would not make that bet, but there are other people now coming into universities, including ACOA, saying, we like this idea. Hire some professors to do cybersecurity. And then we've got an organization called Opportunities New Brunswick that also wants to put, right now they put $30 million towards a building. They don't have any people to put in it yet. But it's going to make us rich, believe me. But you are right that this is the problem about if you're going to be a gambler, which is what universities are going to do in this case, how do we decide which are the professors to bet on or which are the programs? Do we go with the people we have, or do we use this opportunity to go out and hire someone we've never heard of but apparently are world class? So cannabis researchers are benefiting right now because everybody's trying to get a cannabis researcher in. Although with the flattening market that may not pan out, but this is the kind of stuff universities like to do. The highest paid professor at Calgary, I think, was making $700,000 a year, and he was brought in to do some kind of science that would lead to this kind of stuff. How a professor is worth $700,000 a year is beyond me. He didn't teach. He had a great vita, but when the Sunshine List came out and we saw that was the #1 in the province, it was like, wow. They've got really high expectations, but that was the play coming in. Public sources of funding are believed to have encouraged universities to pursue passive knowledge factory missions. There's an idea that historically professors were a lot more into consulting and a lot more open to collaboration because they weren't paid very well. And so it was much easier to go out and pick up a contract in those months over the summer where you weren't teaching, do things like that. But then as our pay went up and as grant money became more generous, it just became more possible to be more autonomous in what we did. We didn't need to go out and collaborate. So there's kind of a view that too much public funding has made us disengaged. Can you start to see the rationale for cutting public funding? We'll make the professors more useful by starving them. So academic institutions evolved to be less focused on practical and applied research and development needs of industry, more oriented towards curiosity-driven research that professors liked. Universities define their missions to produce well-trained graduates, published research results, and faculty consultants. If you're trying to look for a link to GDP growth, it's going to be something that happens by coincidence or luck when that's not even part of the mission. Canada's advisory panel and federal support, the Naylor panel. The federal government should rapidly increase its investment in independent investigator-led research to address the imbalance caused by differential investments favoring priority-driven, targeted research over the past decade. In other words, unwind the Harper-era NCEs with partnership and everything like that, put the money back into the professor-defined research programs. This was the Naylor report. How many years ago did it come out? Was it 2017? Everyone had really high hopes with the Minister of Science, Kirsty Duncan, that this was going to be applied and that it was going to be a bonanza for curiosity-driven research again, in particular basic research. I don't know if there's been the shift everyone expected. But the Naylor panel was quite clear that this is what the university system needed to do, But let's go back. What's David Naylor's priority? A world-class University of Toronto. So if you've applied for CERC lately out of an economics department, there's really only 3 places in Canada that still get these grants. The rest of us are mainly useful for asking for money to increase the pool of funds they get. The Knowledge Factory mission, I don't want to disparage it too much because for a long time it was a terrific way of doing regional adjustment, which was the problem of the Canadian economy from around 1970 up until about the early 2000s. And even then, it was really the demands of the energy sector out west wanted to get more human capital out of the east and into the west. And so when you have these programs that are kind of generic and create importable human capital from other regions, this was terrific for fitting what I would call the national labor market needs. But it's not necessarily going to serve the needs of the provincial labor market. It may not even serve the needs of the students to orient towards the provincial labor market. Because a lot of students have done really well by being mobile across the Canadian economy and even into the US or over into Europe. Or scientists in the 1980s and 90s that couldn't get jobs in Canada did very well going to Australia in a lot of cases. So we have had a terrific post-secondary system. Just hasn't been terrific it's terrific for the students in the country, but what did it do for the provincial taxpayers? Now one argument could be it should be the federal government paying for universities, not the provinces, but that'll be a slightly different one. What about education as an export? This is total enrollment in the 4 Atlantic Canadian provinces, total students in Atlantic universities, 99 to 2015. And for the whole region, the blue is basically domestic students, largely from the home provinces. These top ones are international students. So what we've been seeing with internationalization is, as we've had declining domestic supplies of students, we've been backfilling with more international students. It's still a minority share. In Nova Scotia, it's getting quite large in the green. I'll show you each province separately on the next slide. But the increased recruitment and enrollment of international students has been a response the universities have had to a decline in tuition-paying students. So if we can find an offset on our lost revenue, we can keep going as we are. But we have to pay attention to these human capital exports because up until recently, we didn't expect these students to stay. They'd come in, they'd do their degrees, they'd go home. On the graduate education level, we were selling it as kind of foreign development. We're educating them to go home and they're going to develop their own economies. So we sort of felt we'd done this great solid for the rest of the world, but we just wanted to teach grad courses. So if we get international students that would take them, we were allowed to teach them. But it had no local part. So what goes on here is that when we bring in students, the revenues are from tuition and other mandatory fees. The graduates are going to capture the return to the investment through their incomes when they go and work. But since they leave your province, that's not going to be booked in your DDP or your incomes. And then if they come up with an idea or a commercializable idea like Elon Musk, it didn't happen in Kingston, it happened somewhere else. Although the way he's cratering, we may be lucky he went to the US. University human capital exports are also a subsidized industry because often you could think about the students maybe paying the marginal cost but not necessarily the average cost of putting on the program. So when governments want to charge international students extremely high tuition fees, it's often a point of contention on campus. Is that fair to do? So the solution a lot of universities have are to create niche programs which are cost recovery, and you can charge a lot of money for those. So law schools get to do them as well. That might be another appeal of law, is you get to charge something like 25 grand for the students coming in. They can pay for all their inputs. Just specifically, this is Prince Edward Island. Blue is domestic, orange is the international. If you go to, this is New Brunswick. New Brunswick has been sinking fast in its domestic supply of students. It hasn't been growing the international a lot. It's been pretty steady. Newfoundland is down here where you can see there's been a growing proportion. So the growing enrollment has been kind of pushed by the international stock of students. Nova Scotia is the interesting one. If you've been following Cape Breton this year, they're busting at the seams with international enrollment. They don't have places for anyone to live. They don't have enough part-time jobs for everyone to pay for what they've got to do. But what they've been able to do is really keep demand for their university spaces up by getting international students to replace the declining supply of Nova Scotia-age students. Now, what about the spending multiplier? So the idea here is that if I spend $1 in this economy, it goes around and around and around. At the end of it, it's worth $2 or something like that. If the best explanation of a multiplier effect I've seen was Jerry Garcia explaining why buying dope from the local guy is better for your economy on the movie Festival Express. And he does a really good explanation of the velocity of money. But the idea here is that there's an expectation that if I just spend on the university, it's going to increase GDP just because of spending. But the challenge that comes up is spending on a university any different from spending on social assistance or spending on a new road or spending on any other kind of service. So we have to make a case, is our multiplier any different from any other multiplier the government could pick? Because if we're just a consumption expenditure, we don't have spillovers to growth or anything else, then we're in competition with other uses of funds like relief of poverty, aid to less developed countries, or even increased consumption by taxpayers who get to keep more of their own income. So we have to make a case. So one argument from the 70s is that universities actually have a very weak local multiplier effect because the leakages are large. The students are only around for 8 months, then they go. They tend to buy lower value goods, not the high value goods. And then there's those pesky faculty that don't tend to hang around. And a lot of the trends that are going on in Canada is faculty that don't even live in the community where they're employed. So we had a senior administrator at Calgary who lived in Vancouver and commuted in 3 days a week, but most of that salary was being booked in Vancouver. So you start to see things like cities are now frustrated when they have municipal employees living outside of the municipal boundaries but being paid. They wanted to put in a resident requirement that only residents of the city were allowed to hold the jobs. And it's a place that sounds like St. John's, but it doesn't have an apostrophe or an S that they were trying to do that. So should you have a residency requirement for your staff so that you get the multiplier effect? On the other side, Cantor and Wally, they showed that the large multiplier effects are larger than other spending because of the research spillovers to the local economy and the improved productivity. So the problem with these multiplier things is it's not easy to make a case one way or the other that if I spend on the university, I'm going to get a kick out of that spending over any other thing I could do with the money. Which is why we were trying to go to, can we correlate it with the GDP growth to see, are we more in a Cantor and Wally world or more towards a Wilson and Raymond? But when you just pick a multiplier, the challenge you're going to have is justifying the choice. And universities have some behaviors that don't necessarily help the case. Our provincial, so this gets us to the data part. We're basically, for economic outcomes, we're using GP growth, labor productivity growth, employment, growth in employment, investment, population growth. We also use tax filer data at the level of CMA and all this stuff. It's all provincial level data. This is all from CanSim. We don't have a long time span. We have 10 provinces over 14 years because our limiting factor was university data. So for enrollment, we work again with CanSim, but for university funding overall and research funding, we're using the CAUBO's FIUC database, which only goes up to 2014. But that allowed us to put things towards actual universities, which we could then aggregate to cities and then aggregate up to provinces. So we're just going to basically be looking at measures of university activity and asking, are they correlated with growth of anything? So nothing really fancy. We ran 1 billion regressions, and we only came up with a small number of statistically significant results, which is why I spent so much time talking about why we may not find a statistically significant result. What I will tell you is that if we look at all provinces, all 10 with the big ones in, there are no significant effects of university activity on any outcomes we looked at. If we look at the 6 smaller provinces and the CMAs and CAs, we started to pick up an effect of engineering enrollment. So in other words, if you have more undergraduates enrolled in your programs, that was associated with more growth. We've done these by 3-year moving averages and a whole bunch of other things, but that's the only robust finding that we get. So the kinds of variation that you see is, this is engineering undergraduate students per 1,000 population by province. Newfoundland is the top green one here, so you talked about the volatility. Relative to population, Newfoundland has one of the more volatile engineering enrollments. New Brunswick is this orange bar here. It was going great up until 2008, and then basically the decision at UNB was to hollow out the engineering faculty to preserve the rest of the university. Meanwhile, Nova Scotia, the blue line, just kept going up. And so we're going to pay a lot of attention when we get to the results, the difference between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick after 2008, where they made different decisions. PEI is still trucking along at the bottom. They're very beloved by ACOA for funding their engineering program. If we get to undergraduate students other than engineering, so the rest of the campus, what you see is that Nova Scotia just has basically some volatility around the recession, but it's maintained a high number. New Brunswick did not really show any change in its enrollment through the business cycle, even though it did on engineering. Newfoundland, where did you go? Is this green line here. Newfoundland's non-engineering enrollment also is not sensitive to cyclical influences the same way. So outside of engineering faculties, it kind of looks like steady as she goes, which isn't that surprising because you kind of fill the spots you have, and for a long time we had too many applications for the spaces we had. If you look at total university funding per capita in the provinces, Newfoundland is a high spender after 2008 compared to other provinces, catching up to Nova Scotia, which is the highest spender. New Brunswick maintains its turtle pace at the bottom. And then we get to NSERC funding per capita, again, which is where we believe a lot of the innovation comes from. CIHR does not produce it, even though it's a large funding envelope, so we paid more attention to NSERC. Newfoundland on this one is this line here, so it's been trending down over time. So you're teaching more, but not getting the same NSERC resources per capita. Same with New Brunswick, but what's going on in the region is really, if you look at all these measures, the federal government loves Dalhousie. More and more of the research funding in the region is being concentrated in Nova Scotia. So the same total expenditure by the feds is occurring over time, but they're choosing to send it to one province over a portfolio of them. So that's what it's useful for identifying effects, but it's also, there's something political going on here in terms of where the money goes, and you can guess after 2015 with the supercluster going into Halifax as well for oceans, that's going to probably concentrate even more funding in there. So we estimated a lot of specifications. That's supposed to be, I think my kids call it a GIF where it moves. It's supposed to be a shaking bag. So I'm going to be just blunt. We were trying everything to find an effect, and we were doing that because we couldn't really find many. To display this for people who weren't technical, we had plus means there was a positive correlation, negative is a negative correlation, gray means not significant, black means it was significant. So the only thing we really found was that changes in the level of undergraduate engineering enrollment were significant and positively correlated with GDP growth, labor productivity growth, total factor productivity growth, and employment. No real impact on labor force or investment. Now, do I believe it's undergraduate engineers doing this? No. But it may be that the undergraduate enrollment is the most sensitive correlate with these outcomes. So it's a measure of engineering activity. So when you tend to get more undergraduates, that tends to be correlated with more new hires or potentially more better opportunities for getting research funding coming in. So it may just be a measure of growth of the engineering faculty. For graduate engineering enrollment, we found positive effects, but not significant. And it could be, again, just not enough variation in it. For the undergraduate not engineering, it's generally a negative correlation, though not significant. So the punchline that came out of this, we could find some evidence of a university activity impacting on growth outcomes, and it's the Faculty of Engineering. And the main test we have of this is that if we compare what happened in Nova Scotia versus New Brunswick between 2000 and 2015. Nova Scotia kept investing in engineering. New Brunswick did not. New Brunswick currently has a proposal to restore its enrollment to the level in Nova Scotia, which would be 45 more students enrolled per year over the next 4 years to get, what would that be, another 200 total enrollment. We calculated from our models, if that was done, that would be worth $370 million more GDP for New Brunswick, $865 higher GDP per worker, so more labor productivity, and 1,400 more persons employed in the province. So the question comes down for the next envelope of money for the university, if I'm the government, do I just say to the president, spend it where you like, or do I say, I really like your idea to reinvigorate your engineering faculty? Because that's one place where we also know the province fell behind. So on the policy level, this is where this discussion is coming in. Because the university isn't going to the government and saying, give us money across the board. They're going in and saying, can we have more engineering? And so they want to make a case that more engineering would be good for the economy. You can picture where the biggest fight on this agenda is coming from. It's coming from the non-engineering side of the university, which has declared this would be not fair. They'd get stuck with more service teaching. They're important too. All these arguments are coming up around strategic planning. But the ask, I think, is for $100 million to get the new building, because if you look around Canada, every engineering faculty seems to be getting new buildings. So it's like if those guys got one, we want one. So this leads to the discussion. If I can't find any effects, is this a problem? What should we think about it? I'll just kind of finish with this. Is the lack of a measurable correlation a problem? There's a lot of answers. This no. We should care less if there's no correlation. In fact, this shows we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. The role of a university in society is not to be meeting these short-term needs. It's also, the first one up is I'm just an idiot, that university outputs have long gestation periods, so how could I ever pick them up in my short-run variation? So the great idea I came up with today, it's going to matter 30 years from now. That's the argument that's been made for the national policy that created Canada. It took 30 years for any effects to show up. If you're a politician, I don't think you get 30 years. But the second one is the lack of correlation shows that we're doing what we're supposed to do, which is advancing knowledge rather than addressing local societal needs. Stanley Fish, the guy who did the Save the World on Your Own Time, says the inutility of academic work for economic and societal outcomes is a fact about it and a defining, not a limiting fact. So in other words, we should be proud that we're irrelevant because that's what we should be doing. It's not the job of liberal arts education to bring about a particular effect in the world, and the value of that education should not be defined by extracurricular payoffs. He's a university administrator. So this is his view, is what universities should be doing. Universities argue from weakness when they say, see what we do does in fact contribute to society's prosperity or to community's cultural life or the production of a skilled workforce. So that by this Fish point of view, we should be proud there's no correlations there because we have a higher role in society to do this. The other one is from Canada's advisory panel on support for fundamental science. For Canada, I underline that because this is important, not the province that the university's in. For Canada, research is about harnessing the power of human ingenuity and creativity to advance objectives cherished by our citizenry. A vibrant research ecosystem is essential to a wide range of objectives, and like the fine print on any drugs you might be taking on side effects, these are the side effects of university research. Everything gets better by having this ecosystem. It's not measurable, nor should it be. We just know that it's going on and it's important. And if you read the Naylor panel, they just assert these effects are there, which is ironic because they say we need to be able to demonstrate it, but then they say it's not needed to demonstrate these ones because we know they exist. So I'm going to finish because I'm running out of time. This is a Harry Johnson quote from 1964 when this debate was raging. How many years ago is that? Quite a few. 54, 55 years ago. Most of the contemporary scientific culture argument for government support of basic science is to put it in the class of economically functionless activity. The argument that individuals with a talent for such research should be supported by society differs little from arguments formerly advanced in support of the rights of owners of landed property to a leisured existence, and is accompanied by a similar assumption of superior social worth of the privileged individuals over common men. An insistence on the obligation of society to support the pursuit of scientific knowledge for its own sake differs little from the historically earlier insistence on the obligation of society to support pursuit of religious truth, an obligation accompanied by a similarly unspecific and problematical payoff in the distant future. So,
For an engineer and one paragraph.
so I liked Harry's quote because it kind of sums up a talk that really has no conclusions or no point. That this is the conundrum we have in universities, and the fact that this was 55 years ago and it's starting to come up again means we might want to think about at least what's our argument. But
Take 5 minutes. Is there any questions for 5 minutes? Any questions?
I congratulate you on taking the time.
More comments?
yeah.
Okay, well, thank you.
Well, thanks for your time.
We'll hang around in case people are shy, but
Yeah, no, I appreciate you coming in on a Friday on the reading break and everything. I know it's usually a time everyone's trying to